I've set up this simple scene. I've got a default Bryce sphere here, infinite plane in default grey, a terrain in default grey. It's been set to solid and has a dunes fractal applied to it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to load in a material for this terrain and also one of the preset skies. So if I go to the library here, I'm going to pick out from daytime lazy afternoon. So that's a preset sky, and for the terrain, I'm going to select the terrain, go into the material lab, go in here, find, well, I think we're in Pro Materials, so it's terrain, and I'm going to use scrub and dunes. Before going out of here, I'm just going to make modification in the deep texture editor for this filter, which is selecting between these two texture components on the basis of slope. So if I click that control there, it'll go in there. I'm going to increase the slope there. So what it's going to do is it's going to switch over from one to the other more sharply, and it's going to reduce the amount of green that you see because this also uses slopes. But we'll come back to modifying the material in a bit. Things I want to draw your attention to is that we've got diffuse value and ambient value. Older materials from earlier versions of Bryce, so that were made to work with earlier versions of Bryce before we had good image-based lighting and transience lighting. The only way to get a reasonable effect, a realistic effect of shadows, of light entering the shadow regions, was to use tricks which allowed light to travel through the object, so that would be shadow intensity, and to use ambient colour, which actually lights up the material from the ambient channel. In this case we've got the ambient intensity of 6.2, which isn't very strong, and ambient colours provided as the same as the diffuse colours. So if I boost this now so you can see the influence of this more, you'll see this material seems to have lit up. So I'm going to provide a balance between ambient and diffuse just to demonstrate this effect. So I'm going to check out of here now and we'll have a look how things look. Okay, so clearly you should be able to see that this terrain is glowing, and this control here, this colour swatch, provides the ambient colour, and above it is a control that controls the shadow intensity. So these are two ways of faking the effect of ambient light without having to use more sophisticated lighting models. So I'll show you what each one does in turn. So if I choose an ambient colour that's quite striking, that's the global ambient colour, you can see that this now looks bright red. So you can provide a colour shift through the ambient channel to whatever is provided globally here. If you provide full white, what you will get, if we go back in the material, is the output from this colour choice. So if we go in here and change that to green, for example, and come back, then you can see the material is now glowing green, although the global input is white. So effectively then, if we were to carefully choose this colour, so I'll hold the Alt key down and click on this colour swatch and provide full green output, like so, and then hold this Alt key down and click on this colour swatch and provide a full red output. Because that has no green output in it now, you'll get no ambient response from this material. So you can see now how the global ambient and the ambient colour within the material interact. So I'm going to set the ambient colour to fully black and modify the material so it has no ambient output and give it 100 diffuse. If we're going to use more sophisticated lighting models, then you don't really want any ambient response in a material unless that material is providing a special effect, unless you want it to glow. So if you do want something that looks like it's glowing, you can use ambient to create that effect. It's not the only way, but it is an effective way. So I'll just check out of that now. We've eliminated ambient from our scene, and I've turned the global ambient to fully black, so that's belts and braces. We don't have any ambient. The next thing we could consider is the sky dome colours influence. You can see it's a grey colour here. This again is another method of providing the illusion of ambient light, and it does so by providing a straight down light from above without casting any shadows. To see this on its own, we can just disable the sun or set the sun to fully black. That's probably the easiest option. So I'll set the sun to fully black now. You can't see very much, perhaps just a faint sort of grey blue colour there. So what we'll do is we'll again make this a dramatic colour and you can see its effect. You should also be able to see, since this sphere is above the terrain, I'll just switch to the overhead view by pressing 2. There you go, there's the terrain, there's the sphere, so it's directly above it. So you would expect that if there's a light directly above this, you would see a shadow from this sphere. But the Skydome colour does not cast a shadow. It does interact with bump material, so the bump can apparently cast shadows as a result of the Skydome colour, but that's only self-shadowing on the object. So it's responding to bump, but it doesn't cast any shadows. So if I lifted this terrain up, you would find it's just as light on the infinite terrain underneath. Infinite terrain, infinite plane. I'll do that now while we're talking about it. I'll just lift that up, there you go. So no shadow under that either, as you might expect, even though it's set to solid. So what you can do now, we've got more sophisticated lighting methods, is also get rid of Skydome colour. So that removes that influence from the scene. So the only thing you can see now, maybe a faint edge here, is a result of the haze effect. So the haze effect will, through depth, add lightness to your scene according to whatever colour that is. Finally, while I think about it, I'll just put the sun back in, give it some colour. I don't know what colour it was before. Okay, right, I've popped the sun back in with a bit of colour. There is the shadow intensity control. That can be accessed here. Left click and we can reduce it down to its lowest value, and that takes the shadows cast from the geometry away. You will still get shadow regions appearing as a result of the light not arriving on that side of the geometry. That's a different matter, but this geometry should be casting some shadow on here, and how much shadow it casts, so say set it to 50, so that will be letting half the light through. So you can see that area's light, that's in full darkness. So there's a bit of a mismatch between these two, but what this does is again provides the illusion of ambient light. However, if we've got more sophisticated lighting methods, you want this intensity to be set to 100, and then you can use better lighting. I suppose at this stage what we could do is provide some better lighting. I will reset the sky so I can show you from scratch. So here we go, we'll pick this out again. Let's propose to just give this a quick render and then change it to image-based lighting based on this sky. So that's what it looks like, roughly speaking. We'll set the Skydome colour to fully black, set the ambient colour to fully black, so I don't even need to take it out of the material. If there's no global ambient provided, then it will not influence the material. Now I'll go into the Skylab. When you capture the sky as a HDRI image in image-based lighting using these controls, you have the option, so just click on use HDRI, of just having the Skydome. So if you're not providing you're wanting any light to come from under the ground, then just use Skydome only, and you can use sky straight away. It doesn't really matter about the resolution if you're not intending to use it as a backdrop, because it can just provide the light source behind the existing bright sky. The main choice you have to make here is whether or not you want the sun captured as part of the HDRI image. You see that blob there? That's the sun. That's a light source within the HDRI image. It may look like the sun is just as bright as these clouds over here, but it's not. The nature of HDRI images is you can't actually see how bright that spot is on a monitor, because it can't display the full range of brightnesses. So that sun's going to be quite a bit brighter than the rest of the clouds, but we can't move it once it's captured into the sky other than by moving the sun. For example, if we move the sun, we can recapture the sky, and then that will be baked into a different part of the sky. But we won't have that flexibility. You would have to keep going back and rebaking it in. So what you can do, for example, I'll just put it somewhere where you can definitely see where it is. I want it in this blue area somewhere. Oh, managed to put it in the clouds there. Sometimes it's difficult to interpret what's going on in these. Oh, really, I've managed to hide it in the wrong place. Give me a moment. At least it doesn't take long to regenerate. There you go. Right, you can see the sun is there. So that's part of the HDR image, which is going to provide multiple light sources based on this value here in the quality setting. So if I go to the Sun and Moon tab, I can switch the Sun and Moon off as a visible object. Then when I go to image-based lighting and use sky, I can now capture the sky without the sun. When you capture a HDR image, it automatically disables the sunlight, but if we've captured it without the sun as a visible object, what you can then do is re-enable the sun, so you've got sunlight, and then you can make it visible again if you're going to have it in your scene, so the things like the sun glow colour and aspects like that will have an effect. While I'm here, I'll point out that the sun and moon shadow intensity control really wants to be set at 100 now, because this control doesn't just affect the sun and the moon shadows, it affects all the shadow casting light sources, direct light sources, that are in the scene. So if you have this set down, any radial lights you introduce will also only have an intensity set on this value here, and indeed if they have their own intensity setting, then that will be as a proportion of that total value. So if it's only 50% here and you set it on 50% on the light source, then that will be reduced to 25%, at least that's as I understand it. Anyway, consider that you want to be at 100% intensity here, because if you want intensity control over the individual HDRI simulated light sources that are generated, then you have another control here to do that. For speed, and particularly if you've got a nice busy material on your terrain, then you can set the quality down, and we've also got the sun in here to provide direct lighting, so it's like it's a sunny day. To set the ambient level up, it's often easier to disable the sunlight, and then we can start adjusting these controls here, which will give us a control over the intensity of the, well, I should say the HDR effect. Intensity will relate to the background and also to the effect, but we'll not get too deeply involved there. Let's just concentrate on setting the specularity to 0 and then increasing the effect till we've got some ambient light. Probably too much there, so if I half that and say go 30, we've got to try and consider how much light's going to be arriving from this sky, so let's try 35. That doesn't look too bad. Then we can enable the sun, so that looks rather over bright, so sun and moon tab, and reduce the output of the sun, the diffuse value, since specular's not really being used in this scene as far as I know. So I'll just take that down till it looks like a reasonable balance between the two. So let's try 65, and then have a look how that looks in our scene. So here you go. The light on this side is, I'll just move the sun around to make the shadows more dramatic. The light on this side is arriving from simulated light sources generated within the sky in response to the HDRI image that was captured from the sky. So that gives it its bluish tint because it's blue light arriving from the sky. And then we've got direct light from the sun. So that's quite a lot of blue light. So if we wanted more intense shadows, it would be easy to achieve that by reducing this value here, and then compensate for the less light arriving by adding a bit more light in on the sunlight side. So you just balance these out to whatever you feel is appropriate. Obviously, as the sunlight gets brighter and brighter, it'll start to burn out the colours that are coming from the material, which is why you're careful in balancing these out and controlling the shadow regions that you've got here. This banding effect is because we've only chosen a quality of 16, which means we've only got 16 simulated light sources generated in the dome of the sky. If you want to get rid of the bands, you can increase the quality. It will slow your render time down. But with a fairly wrinkly terrain, such as this is, and a fairly noisy material, like this also is, shadow banding doesn't become an obvious problem, and outdoor scenes generally don't require a great deal of shadow complexity to be convincing. Indeed, you can often get away with just two light sources, a main light source and a fill light, if you set things up right. But having the option to produce HDRI from the sky makes life easier for you, and it does give you a bit more control should shadow banding become a problem. So you can just take it up a notch to 32. And then where I saw one there, you can see it's become a bit softer. It's taken a bit longer to render. Just take it up another step, see how that looks. So I suppose at this point, having considered the lighting situation, we'll have to have a look at the material situation. It's going to be a little bit more complicated there, I'm afraid. So going to the material lab, this filter, so on the left hand side here, that is filtering for, well actually it's this alpha channel that does the filtering. So on the black edge here it's picking out the texture component for horizontal sections, moving round to that number of degrees, and then when it switches to white it starts selecting this texture. So that's taking up this side. We have controls here to change the scale of the texture, its rotation, and a bit of offset from origin. Not really a problem for most of these. Probably the one you would modify would be the scale, because you might want to find a dune pattern. So if the dune pattern's come for this one, we want to find a dune pattern, we could just increase that value there, and you can see it gets a bit finer. It affects all of the components within this texture. I'll just show you how that looks now. So that's got a slightly finer pattern on that, which you might have to use if you're trying to set up the scale of this scene. Color wise, which is what we're really talking about here, if we go into the material lab and then go into the texture source editor, if you're modifying the color, then you're dealing with these color swatches here, and you'll also be looking at the color mode. So in Linear Interpol 3 it uses these three color swatches. In 2 I think it's just the top 2, and you will find by experimentation or looking at other tutorials that I've done what these other options are going to do to the effect of the color as a distribution on this function. But for basic modification, what you need to know is if you hold the Alt key down and click on this color swatch, you can change the color, or you don't have to do it that way. You can just click on the color swatch, hold the left button down, and then pick out new colors. And you want to be looking at the output here to see what influence it's have. So what I should do is go to something very dramatically colored, and then I can see what influence it's having, and then when I know which bits are being affected by that, pick out the color I want for that area. These blend modes, so these are blending slope, will also determine which bit gets coloured in and which bit doesn't have an influence. So what you might find is this left hand edge is only going to be influenced by this, because it's the blend slope will keep pushing that bit through over on top of these colours. So it's going to be down to a bit of an investigation really, until you understand the way the deep texture editor works, and it's fairly involved. Then your best recourse is to just try experimenting, see what influence that bit has, and if you're not really sure where these bits are going to appear, or if they're going to appear at all, then give it a dramatic colour for that bit. Check out again, give it a render, see where that crops up or doesn't in this case, which isn't surprising because that was a bit that was being filtered right out. So this strip, because it's just selecting this strip, anything beyond the edge of that strip is probably not going to get involved. If we go back to this mixing filter and reset it, and then allow it to progress more across the surface, then there's a bit more chance now that some of this red might just appear. You can see that the red has actually sort of mixed into a sort of brown colour by going into the greens there. So as far as colour mixing in the material is concerned, you have to go into the deep texture editor, texture source editor, and look at these colour swatches, change them, having made your modification, come out, and you should at that point be able to identify what colour is coming from which part of these texture components. Other than that then, you've got the ambient, which we covered earlier, and the specular. Now I have got a bit of specular in this material, so if you've got specular, there is another source of unexpected colours depending on your light source. So if I increase the specular output and then give it a very wide specular halo, for example, so you can see we've got some specular effect there, then you can use the sunlight, which is the only source of specular output in this scene, to test where that influence is coming from. So if you got it looking like that and you wondered whether that was diffuse or specular, you can just kill the diffuse output, so you've only got specular output, then make your sun a radically different colour from any other light sources in your scene, and you can see which bits are lighting up from the specular output. So in this way, by applying a process of elimination, you should be able to determine where the troublesome colours are coming from in your scene, whether it's as a result of lighting or whether it's as a result of material or an interaction with the two, as in this case. Although the most likely thing that's going to spoil the appearance of your scene, if you are using more up-to-date lighting methods, is having some sky dome colour that you didn't notice, because that will add light pollution, having ambient colour that's working with an ambient channel in the material that you didn't notice, or having the shadow intensity set down so you've got light leaking through solid objects. And those three things alone, if you make sure you check those and eliminate them, will allow you to get a better control over your lighting through your image-based lighting and also through your material controls. Because these three, because they are workarounds to provide ambient lighting when we didn't have sophisticated lighting available to us, tend to pollute your scene and degrade the image because they reduce the overall contrast within your scene. So there you go, that's the end of this rather lengthy discussion on the effect of lighting on materials and material colours. I hope that's helpful and useful, and that you'll be able to now sort out your problem with the, wherever it was here, the grey possibly coming through the ambient channel here that you couldn't get rid of on your scene. So this video was really made as a result of this comment on the Bryce Talk forum, where JJ had been following this tutorial that I made on the Bryce Desert landscape. So there you go, that's the end of the video.